Okay. So we are in topic 6, all the way at the bottom. Human reproduction. All right. I don't know why it's taking so long to load. Can you guys hear me okay? I don't have my headphones on, so okay. All right, so we're going to finish up understanding number 8 and application number 4, and the video link, once it's done, will be right here. And here is the slideshow. So this slideshow has some additional slides that are not included in the page before this, just so you're aware. I did make some small changes. Okay, so we actually didn't get to the last application from last lecture. We talked about basic anatomy, you just took a review quiz. We didn't talk a lot about the history of reproductive science in terms of humans. So application number 5 talks about William Harvey and his investigation of sexual reproduction in deer. I know that sounds weird, but couldn't really experiment on people, so he wanted to use a mammal that was sort of representative. This is the same guy that discovered blood circulates, right? So remember the guy that walked around Europe and stuck his finger on his arm and his veins popped out, and they showed that your blood circulates and your liver doesn't just consume it. Remember that guy from 6 point whatever, the cardio one? Okay, well, it's him again. He's back at it. But he is not necessarily as successful this time. So when he was a kid, he was taught that seeds formed in males and developed into eggs once it mixed with the menstrual blood inside the mother, right? So everybody knew that you needed a male contribution to a female to produce an offspring, but they weren't really clear on exactly how that worked, right? Remember, this is pre-technology, pre-modern technology anyways, and even really before we had good use of a microscope. So in order to understand this process better, he studied female deer during mating season. So he would observe deer, and after they had copulated, he would slaughter them and then observe their uteri, plural of uterus. So immediately after mating, he didn't really see anything. Didn't see it, which kind of makes sense because it takes time for things to happen, right? But as he was able to observe more deer over time, he noticed that at about the 2nd or the 3rd month after mating, he was able to see some fetal development. And he thought this was proof of his seed in soil theory. So men carry a seed, women carry a garden, plant the seed in the garden, and a baby grows. That was kind of the analogy that was used at the time. He also concluded wrongly that intercourse didn't really necessarily result in new life. Now, how he came to that conclusion, I'm not really sure, except for the fact that, remember, he couldn't see anything right after copulation, right? He didn't see anything happening. So he used that as his reasoning that the two weren't linked. Now, if he had had access to microscopes where he could see smaller cells, he could see the follicle early on, his conclusion might have been different. But if you just stop and think about it for a minute, it kind of seems like he still should have thought, he was observing this process after copulation. It doesn't say he had a control where he was looking at deer that didn't undergo copulation, right? So see if you can think of a good reason for him to say, no, sex doesn't cause having a baby. It's cool. Think about that for a few minutes. I'll give everybody a minute to catch up and get all that down before we continue. Okay, we ready? Give me a thumbs up if you're ready to continue. Okay. No random weird questions about William Harvey and his weird experiments?
When was this? When was this?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Let's look it up. I'm going to say early 1600s, early to mid 1600s, because he was an adult, so early 1600s. Okay, so at this point, you should be able to outline the role of the Y chromosome and, more importantly, the SRY gene in the role of sex determination in zygotes. You should be able to list the secondary sexual characteristics that develop as the result of the presence of testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. And you should be able to outline William Harvey's weird experiments with deer. And hopefully you just completed your quiz, identifying the following structures and their functions. And if you want some more resources or you want a little more information than I've given you so far, here are some crash course videos and some other informative links to help you with that. And now we're going to move on to the next major portion of this topic, specifically the menstrual cycle. Everybody's favorite. Now, we will get to the discussion about how birth control modifies the menstrual cycle and how it works, but that comes at the end of this section. So we will be talking about that today or next rotation. It's in here. Again, as always, if you have weird and awkward questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will read them and not read your name and answer them to the best of my ability. Because, now is the time to ask. And if you are brave, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask too. If you're in the classroom, you might want to put it in the chat anyways, though, because I know we get bad feedback sometimes. Okay. So the menstrual cycle, and I don't know why we call it the menstrual cycle. Men don't get it. I don't get that. Menstrual. There's no men. Anyways, the menstrual cycle occurs in women from puberty until menopause. Now, this is different than males. Once males start producing sperm when they go through puberty, they continue producing it till the end of their life, right? Women, not so much. We have a definitive window. So puberty until menopause. Menopause is the cessation of this process. So the menstrual cycle is about a 28-day cycle. And each cycle, an ovum, otherwise known as an egg, you'll hear those words used interchangeably, is released from the ovary through the fimbriae into the fallopian tubes. And this allows the opportunity for pregnancy to occur. And this cycle involves several hormones that we're going to talk about. And it also includes both positive and negative feedback cycles. So this is where we did homeostasis and positive and negative feedback cycles first, because it's really feedback cycles that maintain this process. And it is kind of complicated, but we'll go through it step by step. You should be aware that I have seen skills questions on the IB exam that ask students to outline the process of this cycle. So you do have to understand what hormones do what and which show positive feedback and negative feedback. So when we're talking about menstruation, like we talk about your period, we're really talking about the secretion of the uterine lining. And a lot of people consider that like the end of the cycle, right? But in reality, that's the beginning of a cycle, of one whole cycle. So you'll see, I have a series of diagrams that show the days, they show the phase, and they show kind of what's happening. And this falls under understanding number 8. The menstrual cycle is controlled by negative and positive feedback mechanisms involving ovarian and pituitary hormones. So this is the last major understanding in this topic. And we will talk about a couple of applications though too. So day 1 of a cycle, right? That's menstruation. So this is when the uterus lining or the endometrium starts to break down and menstruation occurs. And this is different for different people. So for some people, this is longer than 5 days. For some people, it's much shorter. Birth control does affect the length of menstruation. And in fact, it's not even really, if you're using birth control, it's not true menstruation because most of the time you don't ovulate. So for the sake of argument, we're going sans birth control right now. We're just going to talk about the natural cycle. And then these numbers are the days. And we'll talk about the major phases. Okay, so the entire cycle itself can be divided into 2 major phases. The first phase is the follicular phase, and it's when a group of follicle cells develops in the ovary. Now you're going to hear the word follicle and follicular a lot. You can think of a follicle as a pocket in which the egg develops. So in that follicular pocket or follicle, that egg is stimulated to grow. It begins to occur during menstruation. So a new egg is developing and growing while you're menstruating. So as you're getting rid of the old endometrial material, a new egg is growing and getting ready. At the end of the follicular phase or stage, the egg is released into the oviduct, and that's what we call ovulation. Now, after ovulation, the egg is released, it goes into the fallopian tubes, it does its thing. But that pocket, that follicle that grew the egg, it sticks around. And it becomes what's called the corpus luteum. And this is the initiation of the luteal phase. This is the second major phase in the menstrual cycle. So that pocket becomes the corpus luteum. Now that's important because that corpus luteum actually secretes and emits its own hormones. So this is a really important part of the cycle. Oh my God, can you guys hear all that construction that's going on outside my window? Yeah, I'll put my headphones on. Sorry, guys. You might still be able to hear it with my headphones on, but hopefully less. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, hopefully you'll be able to hear that stuff less, and also the random noises of my household. My desk is downstairs in like the dining room, living room area, because we also have two upstairs, but they're all occupied, so this is my spot. Okay. So, say that egg doesn't become fertilized and it doesn't implant or embed into the endometrium in the uterus. If that doesn't happen, then that corpus luteum breaks down and the cycle starts over. Give me a thumbs up when you're ready to continue. Emily's ready. Is the breakdown your period? So the breakdown of the corpus luteum is not your period. The breakdown of the endometrium is your period. So the breakdown of the corpus luteum happens at the same time as the breakdown of the endometrial lining. And why those two things correlate will become clear in a minute, because it has to do with hormones and which hormones are released. So if that corpus luteum breaks down, that's a signal to your uterus, okay, time to get rid of this endometrial lining. A new follicle is going to develop, and we're going to start the cycle all over again. And that's really important, because you don't want to be pregnant with two different eggs that were fertilized at two different times. Humans are not big enough to carry multiple pregnancies at the same time. Now, we can carry multiple babies at the same time, but that's usually the result of IVF or a blastula splitting into two different individuals. Occasionally, you have multiple eggs that are fertilized. So fraternal twins is when two different eggs get fertilized at the same time, but they're fertilized in the same window. It's not like one's fertilized 1 month and then the next one's fertilized the next month. That's a no-no. So your body has to keep that from happening. Only one fertilized egg at a time. Okay, so this is kind of an image that's showing you what's happening during these stages. So here we have the ovary, and here we have the fimbriae, and the oviduct, also known as the fallopian tube. So there's another question, would it be too much? Would 2 placentas be too much? Yeah, 2 placentas would be too much. There's not enough space, right? So, and you have different things happening at different times, and your body can't handle both of those processes, because your body only uses one set of chemical messengers, right? So it's hard to have 2 different processes going that use those same chemical messengers and have those processes happening at different times. Your body would get confused. So you can only have like one at a time. You have one set of chemical messengers. Think of it as like one set. It's like a conversation. Your body's hormones are telling your body to do certain things at certain times. Those same hormones can't be used to tell your body to do 2 different things at the same time, right? It all works together as one conversation. Okay, so here we have that ovary, and here are the fimbriae, and we have, if you start right here, this is where that diagram starts. You have an egg that's developing inside of a follicle. You'll see it says developing follicles. So during ovulation, that egg is released, and that follicle becomes the corpus luteum. So here's our egg. It's traveling down the fallopian tube. Fertilization happens in the fallopian tube. One of the number one mistakes that I see students make, whether it's freshman year and you're doing freshman biology, or whether it's junior or senior year and you're doing SL or HL biology, is that they assume that fertilization happens in the uterus. That is not the case. Those sperm have to travel all the way up through the uterus, in through the fallopian tubes, and fertilization happens here. So those initial stages of development, so those first mitotic divisions, they're actually happening in the fallopian tube. Now, we talked a little bit about ectopic pregnancies before. If that fertilized egg doesn't continue moving, right, that's called an ectopic pregnancy. So here you can see there's a cleavage line forming. This is indicating that mitosis is happening and these cells are dividing. The initial stages are called the morula, blastocyst, and then eventually you have implementation of that fertilized egg, that zygote, into the endometrial wall. And then this is where that placenta will develop. So it's important to understand that once the ovary releases that egg, the ovary still controls what's happening because of this corpus luteum. Thumbs up when you're ready. Charles is ready. cleavage. I'm getting a question about cleavage. So cleavage is the line. So remember mitosis, PMAT, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, when cells are dividing. So cleavage is that line that forms during cytokinesis. So telophase, when the cytoplasm divides, and it's like the last step of mitosis, right? So cleavage is just the line between two cells. Like when you think of cleavage like boobs, it's the line between the boobs, right? So cleavage in cells is just the line between where those two cells pull apart during cytokinesis. So cleavage, or think of like an axe cleaver, like it chops something, it's the dividing line between two things. Okay, we're gonna keep going. All right, so this graph is kind of complicated, but I like it because it does a good job of showing you everything that's happening at the same time. So at the top, you have ovarian histology. So this is the stage of the egg in the corpus luteum. So here we have a tiny little follicle. The follicle is growing and it's fostering that egg. And then we have ovulation. The follicle releases the egg. The follicle then becomes the corpus luteum. And then it breaks down if there's no implantation of an embryo. Now, your body temperature also changes during this process. So people that are trying to get pregnant, women will take their basal body temperature. It's their body temperature first thing in the morning when they wake up. And if they notice a big jump in their body temperature, and by big jump, I mean like a degree or two, right? It's a spike comparatively across the rest of the month. That's a good indication that ovulation is happening. So there are apps that will help you track your cycle, whether you're using it to prevent conception or increase your chances of conception. Basal body temperature is one of those metrics that you can use to help track that process. Now, below body temperature, you also see hormones. So these are all the different hormones that we're going to talk about. Luteinizing hormone, estrogen, estradiol, estrogen, same thing, progesterone, and follicle stimulating hormone. And we'll talk about, I know it looks complicated, but we'll take that step by step. And then in the bottom of the graph, you also have menstruation. And this is the thickness of the uterine lining, right? So this is the endometrium, how thick it gets. Because it's not just like it disappears and it appears. It's got to like build and grow, right? It's tissue. It takes time to develop. So during menstruation, you shed that lining. And then over the rest of, here are the days down here. As the days during the menstrual cycle, the whole menstrual cycle increase, right? The uterine lining gets thicker. I probably should have said this to start with. I kind of alluded to it, but I didn't really make it very clear. So in common language, in common conversation, if somebody asks you, how long is the menstrual cycle? Most people will say like a week, right? That's not really the case. So menses, or the actual shedding of the lining, takes about a week, but the menstrual cycle itself is 28 days long. So your period is a week long, but the whole menstrual cycle is 28 days long. So days of the menstrual cycle, 28. And here you can see everything that's happening at the same time. And this is nice because it also lets you kind of see the relationship between what's happening in all these different places. So we're going to talk about progesterone, estrogen, follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. All right, so let's take it step by step. So proliferation. This is the stimulation or the initial development of that follicle and that egg. So we're talking right here, first couple of days, right? This is also during menstruation. So we have the egg that's developing inside the follicle. After the initial menstruation, you start to see that uterus lining repairing, preparing for the next egg in case it gets fertilized. If you look at the hormones, we're going to look at FSH. That's the red hormone here. Sorry if you're colorblind. I didn't make this image. Right? It's this image, this line here. So in the beginning, we're going to look at this slight increase. Follicle stimulating hormone causes that follicle to grow and causes that egg to develop. And you kind of like, it's a dead giveaway. Follicle stimulating hormone. So like, what does FSH do? It stimulates the follicle to grow. Follicle stimulating hormone. It's named for what it does. So once that follicle has developed, right? You see big rays. You'll also start to see an increase in estrogen. Now, once that estrogen hits a high enough level, it's going to inhibit FSH because we don't want to stimulate more eggs to grow. We only want one egg developing at a time. Women are born with the total number of cells that are going to become eggs. And those are present when you are still in your mother's uterus. So it's kind of weird, like if you think about it. You, or the egg that became you, was present in your grandmother's uterus. Because it was present in your mother, in your grandmother's uterus. So when you talk about how different things influence multiple generations, that's a good example of how the environment in your grandmother's uterus has a direct impact on you because the cell that became you was present in that uterus. So anyways, back from like the time warp of like hanging out in your grandmother's uterus, because that's also a little weird. That high level of estrogen prevents FSH. This is negative feedback. And it's because we only want one egg developing at a time. Estrogen also initiates the release of LH. And you can see that as this estrogen is the blue one, estradiol is the same thing. As this estrogen peaks, right, that's causing LH to peak. So a peak in estrogen causes luteinizing hormone to spike. And during this time, this uterine lining is continuing to thicken. It's continuing to get ready to receive that egg. Okay. So on a scale of 1 to 5, oh, wait, let's see. I see a question. Can you define proliferation in a quick layman's term way? Okay, so proliferation is the development of the egg and the preparation of the uterus to receive it. Pro-life, you are creating the conditions for pregnancy to occur. You're getting an egg ready, and you're preparing the uterus. During proliferation, you see negative feedback between estrogen and FSH after one egg has developed. That's to prevent multiple eggs from developing at the same time. Because you only have so many eggs. When you run out of eggs, that's menopause. Okay, now do me a favor, everybody flick your camera on and give me a 1 through 5. How comfortable are you with proliferation? And yes, that is why people harvest their eggs. Good, okay. I'm seeing good numbers. So yes, somebody asked a question, is that why people harvest eggs? So yes, there's actually a lot of different new technologies out there to help maintain fertility longer. So you hear about people that are in their 50s and 60s having babies. Oh, am I frozen? Am I back? Okay. Okay, so let me start over. Somebody asked a question, is that why people harvest eggs? So because women only have so many eggs, and then once you run out, then it's menopause. So yes, you'll notice that you'll hear in the news about people that are in their 50s having babies, or people in their even later than that having kids, and or people donating eggs for IVF, and IVF is a part of this topic. We'll talk about that too. So yeah, there are a couple of different new ways that we can kind of like stave off menopause, because menopause is when you run out of eggs. One of those ways is some women are actually having a portion of their ovaries removed and frozen, and then when they get later in life towards menopause, they have those pieces reimplanted so that they have those eggs again. There's hormone replacement therapy that you can take. It doesn't necessarily save your eggs, but if you are more focused on your career and you're not necessarily interested in having children when you're young, or if you're not interested in carrying a child yourself because of medical reasons or personal reasons, and you want a surrogate to carry your egg, you can harvest eggs and freeze them and save them, and then use them later for IVF or other different kinds of processes to fertilize an egg and create a child. So yes, that's why people harvest eggs. Long and short. Okay. Let's keep going. Oh, I don't know why I had these out of order. Sorry about that. Menstruation is day 1 through 6. That follicle inside the ovary is immature, so that's the starting part, right? Egg is immature. The uterus lining breaks down, and the pituitary gland releases follicle-stimulating hormone. So it's menstruation, then proliferation. Sorry about that. I don't know how those got switched. So if I had to draw it on here, I would say this is menstruation. Well, till there, I guess. And then from here, this is proliferation. It's really messy. Menstruation, and you can see menstruation kind of stops there. And then from here to here is proliferation. Yes, this comes before proliferation. So my slides were backwards. Menstruation is day 1 through 6. Proliferation is going to be day 7 through 14. And you can see that here. So menstruation is 1 through 6. And then proliferation is right here. My bad. I should fix that right now. Okay, we ready? Not yet. I think in-class people are frozen. Or it's me again. Am I back? Okay. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, Amelia can hear me. So my computer is telling me that subtitles aren't available right now because the internet connection is slow. So sorry about that. Okay, so at day 14, this is ovulation. Those high luteinizing hormones cause that follicle to burst, and the follicle is released into the fallopian tube. And that uterine lining is maintained in preparation for an incoming fertilized egg. Give me a thumbs up when you're ready. Charles is ready. Sade is ready. I see hands up. Good. Oh, nope, that's somebody stretching. All right. Now, assuming that the egg is fertilized, okay, that luteinizing hormone results in the formation of that corpus luteum. That's the structure that's left over after the egg is released. That corpus luteum is actually responsible for secreting progesterone. It's progesterone that maintains the uterus lining. When you take birth control, you are artificially changing the levels of estrogen and progesterone. And we'll talk more about that later. But progesterone is the thing that maintains your uterine lining. So you'll notice your progesterone, it's this black line. So it is released and it maintains the thickness. See how that curve matches the thickness of the uterine lining? And as that progesterone starts to decrease, if that egg isn't fertilized, right? If you come back over here, because remember, this is a cycle, that progesterone levels are very, very low. And when those progesterone levels are low, you lose that menstrual lining. So after ovulation, it is progesterone that maintains the thickness of this uterine lining. If an embryo or a zygote implants into that uterus, this corpus luteum doesn't break down. It stays. And it maintains that uterine lining during the 9 months of pregnancy. If no embryo implants in the uterus lining, that corpus luteum breaks down, progesterone levels fall, and the cycle starts over. What number of days is ovulation and implantation? Okay, so ovulation typically occurs on day 14. And implantation is a chance event, right? So it really should be if an embryo is implanted, and that could happen anytime between days 19 and 27, right? I guess the window for implantation is anytime after ovulation. So I guess we can say day 15 through 28. We'll say 15 through 28. So here's another question. What is the window of conception? That's different. That's pretty short, and we'll talk about that. So your window of conception, it ranges. Some sources say 6 days. Other resources say 3 days. But we'll talk about that. It's a very specific window, and it's not super long. It's basically ovulation and a few days after. That's your window of conception. Implantation typically happens after that because, egg has to get fertilized. That's conception. And then implantation happens later typically. But we call the whole period of time after ovulation, we call it implantation. I don't know why. Okay. Ready? We lose Sade? I think we lost Sade. Nope, there she is. All right, give me a thumbs up if you're ready. Good. Okay. All right, so here is that cycle graph that we talked about. So typically, our cycle starts with menstruation. We have the uterus lining thickening. We have ovulation occurring. And then after ovulation, there's a small window for conception. And then after that, if that egg is fertilized and it implants, progesterone maintains that uterine lining and the cycle stops. So that's negative feedback, right? If progesterone is present, If an egg is fertilized, the cycle stops. If the egg is not fertilized, right, the cycle repeats itself. So let's review real quick. Follicle stimulating hormone. It stimulates follicle growth. It also stimulates estrogen secretion and progesterone secretion. It's a big spike in FSH that stimulates ovulation. And FSH comes from the pituitary gland. LH, luteinizing hormone, is also released by the pituitary gland, and it is also contributing to ovulation. Its biggest component is the stimulation of the corpus luteum, right? Luteinizing hormone, corpus luteum. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates follicle growth. Estrogen is produced by the growing follicle inside the ovary. It stimulates the endometrium, and it inhibits follicle stimulating hormone because we only want one egg released at a time. And then there's progesterone. Progesterone is released by the corpus luteum. That's what the follicle becomes after the egg is released. It maintains the endometrium thickness, and it also inhibits FSH and LH. This is negative feedback. If there's a baby in there, you don't want to stimulate another egg, right? There's only room for one baby at a time. It's this negative feedback cycle that we manipulate through the use of birth control. If you can maintain progesterone levels, that causes your body to not release additional eggs. If you don't release additional eggs, there's nothing to be fertilized. If there's nothing to be fertilized, you don't get pregnant. So hormonal birth control works by suppressing the natural cycle by maintaining artificially high levels of progesterone. You're tricking your body into thinking, sort of, that you're already pregnant, so you don't release any more eggs. So there's a question that says, if these are the functions of these hormones, why does artificially introducing them with birth control cause such weird side effects? Because, like I said, if you're basically tricking your body into thinking something's happening that's not, and that's bound to cause weird side effects. Now, the purpose of these hormones is to prepare the body to maintain another individual, right? To foster the development and growth of another entity. So when you're taking birth control, you're preventing ovulation so that you can't, you don't fertilize another egg, but you're also tricking your body into thinking, hey, I need to be getting ready for pregnancy. So that's the cause of some of those feedback or some of those side effects. And there's another question, does that hypothetically save eggs? So this is a weird question. Yes, it does save eggs, but that doesn't mean that you don't go through menopause. You'll still go through menopause eventually because it's not just having the eggs, it's your body's ability to produce follicle stimulating hormone, right? So even though you have those eggs hanging out in your ovary, your pituitary gland is like, yo, you're too old to be producing FSH. The eggs might be there, but we're not going to start secreting FSH to stimulate the growth of them. And if you don't stimulate the growth of those eggs, you're inhibiting the production of estrogen and progesterone. So it's not just having the eggs, it's your pituitary gland too, which is in your brain. All right, so how do you feel about this mess of hormones on a scale of 1 to 5? Good. Guys have it so much easier. It's basically like testosterone, up and down, up and down, up and down. And FYI, guys, you also have a monthly testosterone cycle too, where your testosterone levels change. And in fact, the whole thing where like girls sync up with each other doesn't actually happen. However, girls' cycles do sync up with their guy companions. So girls' cycles will mimic and follow cycles of peaking and decreasing testosterone in guys. So you guys also have a cycle. We just don't talk about it because you don't bleed. All right, so we're going to talk about in vitro fertilization. Actually, you know what? We'll do in vitro fertilization after. Since we just did the hormonal cycle, let's talk about birth control now, and then we'll do IVF next rotation. So I had lots of questions last time in the chat window about how birth control works. And there's a lot more different types of birth control than I have on this slide. This is just a generalization that shows you the different kinds. So there's hormonal birth control that mimics and messes with those feedback cycles that we just talked about that influence ovulation. There's also non-hormonal birth control methods. So when we say non-hormonal, we mean understanding what part of the cycle you're in, so avoiding sex during times when you could conceive. There's a copper IUD, which decreases the uterine lining. It doesn't affect ovulation, but it decreases the uterine lining, so there's nowhere for the egg to implant, or there's less area for the egg to implant. So you're still ovulating, you're still having that natural cycle of hormones, but implantation is typically unsuccessful. And then there's male condom, which is just a barrier method, right? That prevents sperm from getting in. When we're talking about hormonal contraceptives, we're talking about the pill, we're talking about a hormonal IUD that does release different hormones that changes that feedback cycle, or NuvaRing, or another ring, and that actually releases hormones as well. There are other ones. There's Depo Shot, which is hormonal. There's implants. Those are hormonal. Your non-hormonal methods are really restricted to tracking your cycle or pull out, right? Copper IUDs or some sort of barrier method, whether it be female condom, male condom, sponge with spermicide in it, or something like that, diaphragm. A lot of the stuff we don't use so much anymore because we have better ways to do it. So we're going to limit our conversation mostly to the hormonal birth control and how that works, because we just talked about hormones for the most part. So here we see a couple of different tables that show you success rates. So just using, you see there's a thermometer there, that's to track the basal body temperature. If you are just tracking, can you hear me? My internet is unstable. Did I freeze? Nope. Okay, I can see Emily's fan working in the background, so that means I am not frozen. Okay. Oh, now I'm frozen. Okay. So natural cycles, like I just ovulated, so we're going to chill for a week, right? Through typical practice, that's effective about 93% of the time. If you are tracking everything perfectly, it's 98%. Oh, I have a question. What is the sponge thing I was talking about? Sponge is exactly what it sounds like. It's a little circular sponge, and you soak it in spermicide, and you put it up in the vagina and sit it right in front of the cervix. It's kind of like you would put a tampon in, and it just sits there. And then if there are sperm, the spermicide kills the sperm and it doesn't swim up into the uterus. So that's what the sponge is. There was a joke in Seinfeld, the TV show, whether sponges aren't used so much anymore because they can cause infection. You remember how we talked about you don't want stuff up there that's not supposed to be up there because it's basically an open pathway into your body. So we don't use sponges so much anymore because if you use them improperly or you don't keep them clean, it can cause bacterial infections. Okay, back to birth control methods. So, natural cycle, if you're just paying attention to where your cycle is at, if you're good at it, chances of success are about 93%. That means if you have sex 100 times, you are likely to become pregnant 7 out of those 100 times. So if you're serious about it, this is not necessarily a way to go. If you're doing it perfectly, even it's not really perfect. It's 98%. Using the pill, a daily pill that you take, same thing. It's about 93%. And that's because those pills are exactly 24 hours worth of hormones. So if you're changing the window, so say you take it in the morning one day and then you take it at night the next day, that's a 12-hour gap that you're missing. And in that 12-hour gap, that natural system is going to take over and you're going to ovulate, right? So birth control pills are good. They're good for other things. They're good at eliminating a lot of symptoms that come with your menstruation cycle, if you have really bad PMDD or if you have really bad cramps and you take birth control to kind of mitigate those side effects, then the birth control aspect of it doesn't really matter. But if you're taking it for birth control, it is very specific. So even, there's a question about even 2 or 3 hours. Yeah, even 2 or 3 hours. You need to be, if you're taking oral birth control, you need to be setting an alarm and taking it at the same time every day, 8 in the morning, 8 in the evening, whatever, 12 at noon with lunch. You need to take it at the same time every day. And this is the reason why the typical use percentage is so much lower than perfect use. If you took it at the exact same time every single day, it's 99% effective. If you don't, if you're screwing around with the time that you take it, it's less effective. Condoms, typical use, it's about 87% effective. With perfect use, it's about 98% effective. It's not perfect because they break. Sometimes there are holes. Accidents happen. It's not a perfect method. Hormonal IUDs are the most effective at preventing pregnancy. I have a hormonal IUD. I love it. It's great. Now, all of these hormonal methods, they do nothing to protect you from STDs, right? STD protection not included. We're simply talking about pregnancy right now. So if you are at a point in your life where, and my situation is different, I'm married, I'm not sleeping with anybody else, I'm set, right? So the only thing I'm concerned about is pregnancy protection. For y'all, you also have your whole lives ahead of you. So I encourage you to be thinking about both hormonal birth control to prevent pregnancy, but then there's the whole other side of this conversation, which is preventing STDs. So for preventing STDs, you really want to go with something like a barrier method, right? And that prevents the transmission of biological pathogens that cause disease. NuvaRing, or rings that you insert into your vagina that stay there throughout the month that release hormones, again, they're about as effective as taking the pill or natural cycles. And that's because they move around, they slip out. People take them out when they take a shower and they clean them and they put them back in. It's just not, humans are humans. They're not perfect, right? Perfect use, it's over 99% effective. But I personally have had friends that have used NuvaRing and ended up pregnant. There's fertility awareness, which is kind of the same thing as natural cycles. However, if you're not being very specific and precise in tracking your cycles, using a logger, using an app, tracking your temperature, and you're just counting days with no backup, it's not very effective. And then there's always pull-out game, right? And that's the least effective. Let's just say accidents happen. Okay. And then over here you see just the number of pregnancies that occur over a year on average using these different methods. So question, did the IUD hurt? hurt's not the right word. It was a little uncomfortable at first. So implantation was a little uncomfortable. It was a little uncomfortable for about a week. And like now I don't even know it's there. And they last years. So like they last 5 or 6 years. So you're basically set. Like you implant it, you're uncomfortable for a week, and then you're good for like half a decade. And then you go in and get it changed out. So Leif Holstrom, why isn't there hormonal birth control for men? That's a great question. Okay, so there are 2 different answers to this question. One, pregnancy has typically been considered the responsibility of women because they are the ones that get pregnant. Rightly or wrongly so, right? It takes 2, but because it happens in our bodies, most of the onus is put on us to prevent it, right? Because guys, once they're done, they can get up and walk away. There's no consequence for them. So most of that initiative is left on the woman to make sure that she prevents pregnancy. There are initiatives to create birth control pills for men. Last I heard, there was one in production. The question is there a market for it, right? So it's, and this might be more of an older generation thing where men are like, that's not my job. I'm not taking nothing, right? So there's a public and cultural aspect to whether it would be successful if it was marketed. And remember, it's pharmaceutical companies that are making these drugs. So if it's not profitable for them, they're not going to make it. Now, is it possible, like scientifically possible? Yeah, and it's being worked on. I am hopeful in the next, couple of decades that it becomes commonplace and effective, or not effective, but it becomes commonplace and culturally acceptable. So there's another question, can IUDs get knocked out or knocked out of position? They can't get knocked out. Like, they don't fall out. They get lost, like, up in there. They can move. They do shift. So when I have to go for my annuals, they usually do just a quick sonogram to see where it is to make sure it's in the right place. Having them changed out can be a little uncomfortable if it like gets up to where it's not supposed to be. But really, it's temporary discomfort. There are some class action lawsuits about some of the non-hormonal IUDs, like copper IUDs, if they break. If they break, that can cause an issue. But that's not been an issue so much anymore. And it's time to go. So we're going to continue this conversation next rotation. All right, guys. As always, it's a pleasure. I'll see you Friday.